Hello and Tashi Delay. Welcome to this first episode of Tibet Unlocked, the podcast. My name is Laden Tetong. I'm a Tibetan, I'm an activist, and I am the co-founder and director of Tibet Action Institute. I am thrilled to be launching Tibet Unlocked here today with a few of my friends and colleagues. Joining me is Nathan Freitas, Director of Technology at Tibet Action. Nate works to build secure, open-source mobile solutions for activists, journalists, and human rights organizations. Also joining us is Tendor, Senior Researcher and Strategist at Tibet Action. Tendor was born and raised in the Tibetan refugee community in India, and he's currently doing his PhD in political science at Columbia University. Also with us, Kate Wasno from Vancouver. Kate is director at Tibet Action, and she's a longtime campaigner who, in the Tibet movement, who helped plan and lead the global campaign challenging China's Beijing 2008 Olympic Games. So Tibet Unlocked is a new initiative of Tibet Action Institute. And to get right to it, why this podcast? Why now? And why are we calling it Tibet Unlocked? As many of you will know, Tibet is just not in the news these days. It's very rare for anyone to turn on the radio or open the paper, see on the TV news, any coverage, especially meaningful coverage of the Sino-Tibetan conflict in the mainstream media for sure. Now, I'm asked all of the time what is happening in Tibet and why don't we hear about it anymore? And sadly, this is by design of the Chinese authorities. Beijing has imposed an information blackout on Tibet by both locking down the borders and severely restricting the flow of people and information in and out of the country. They do this in a number of ways, including by criminalizing the sharing of news and information by Tibetans in Tibet with people outside of Tibet. And they make it very dangerous to maintain any contact or connection with people outside of Tibet. And Tibetans themselves, they're not allowed to leave Tibet. The vast majority of Tibetans are not allowed to have a passport or to travel abroad legally. And they can't even escape these days. Where thousands once made it out every year on foot into Nepal and India over the Himalayan mountains, now only a few make it. And on top of this, the international community, certainly journalists, government officials, academics, NGOs, most people cannot get into Tibet because China so strictly controls the special permits that you need, that foreigners need to enter Tibet on top of just the Chinese visa. And certainly most Tibetans living in exile can't go back. Even a few can, and those are usually the very few who are from Tibet. They have immediate family there. And those that are allowed to go under very strict conditions of where they're allowed to go, how long they're allowed to stay. And they will be under constant surveillance and pressure, and in many cases, even having to meet with the local Public Security Bureau officials or authorities. In addition to this, China is enforcing a silence on Tibet in the outside world. Beijing does this by espionage and spying on and intimidating Tibetans living in exile, as well as retaliating against anyone who dares to speak against China's policies in Tibet. And that, I say anyone, it could be world leaders, governments, corporations, universities, even Hollywood actors and singers and professional athletes. So in these ways, the Chinese authorities are not just trying to hide the truth of their repression in Tibet, but they're also trying to effectively turn off the global spotlight that shines on Tibet and has for many years now. And so that's why we're launching this podcast now, because we want to help people better understand the situation on the ground inside Tibet. We want to help deepen understanding about the importance of the political movement and activism for Tibet. And we want to do this by bringing new and different voices into the conversation, especially people who might not otherwise be heard out in the mainstream media and beyond. So, yeah, I guess maybe just straight to Tendor to open up. Here we are with our first podcast to try to focus the spotlight on Tibet and to have conversations that you might not otherwise hear anywhere out in the podcast space or on social media. We're going to talk about Tibet in hopefully new and different ways, but we're going to talk about Tibet, just what's happening, because people don't know. And so what's your take on the current situation and why it's so difficult?
Yeah, I think we are living in a really unique time in history, a very strange kind of moment when there is a lot of facilities that connect people, the platforms that connect people. And pretty often, whether it's through the apps like WeChat or other types of Chinese-run apps, there's a great deal of connection and exchange. But when we actually try to look at the number of meaningful exchange that happens across the Himalayan divide between people inside Tibet or people in exile, it's probably at one of the lowest points in history. The kind of things that used to happen, if we were talking about 5 to 10 years ago, something would happen in Tibet and we would hear about it within hours, sometimes within days. And right now, one of the ironic things is communication is instant. So there is real-time communication over, whether it's over TikTok or WeChat. But all of these platforms that Tibetans are using are not only controlled by the Chinese government, but actually curated such a degree that the Chinese government at this point is not just talking about, they're not just planning to or trying to control or repress the discourse and exchange of information between Tibetans in Tibet and in exile. They're not only trying to control and repress the discourse on Tibet, even internationally. What they are doing right now is at a much higher level where they're actually trying to shape the discourse. They're trying to lead the discourse. They're actually influencing the discourse and influencing decision makers, power holders, academics, activists, media, kind of control that the Chinese government exercises over the flow of information related to Tibet is actually much more granular and also much more ambitious than I think any regime has ever tried to do. So that's the kind of time that I think we are living in under right now. And that's why I think a project like this particular podcast that we are trying to release into the world and trying to work on actually has a really important purpose to serve right now. The way the Chinese government right now is cracking down, the intensity of the crackdown on the flow of information related to Tibet, especially between exiles and those in Tibet, families that have been separated, friends that have been separated, parents and children that have been separated, every single communication that flows in between. Control is so severe that even the media is not able to cover much on Tibet just because of the blackout that you just mentioned, Laden. And then on top of that, I think there is another kind of information control that happens at the level of global discourse, right? That doesn't affect only Tibetans. It actually affects governments, it affects media, it affects academics, it affects researchers, decision makers. Anybody who's trying to learn more about Tibet right now is actually affected by the kind of control that the Chinese government is exercising over information. And, we are seeing this play out in the kind of coverage that Tibet gets, not only in the media, but also in academic publications as well, which is, anybody who's working on Tibet somehow is held hostage by the Chinese government because you are relying on the Chinese government for access, whether it's access to Tibet, whether it's access to the archives, whether it's access to subjects that you are trying to talk to. And that access, whether it's access to visa, that access has been weaponized by the Chinese government so successfully and so deftly that the entire discourse on Tibet has also been affected very negatively. And that's why I think right now is probably a very important time to be starting a project like.
Kate, did you want to jump in and just give your thoughts on why we are in the situation we're in and why this podcast now?
Yeah, I thought when I was listening to Tendra, and I agree with everything Tendra said, and I realized too, I think what we've seen in the past decade, 12 years, is so that we know the Chinese government was caught off guard with the 2008 uprising. They thought they sort of had Tibet locked down. And I think what 2008 did is it very much showed that they didn't, and especially in eastern parts of Tibet. And I think what we've seen since that time, well, and we say 2008 2008, but we know the uprising went on to 2009 and 10, and then the student protests in UMDO in 2010. So you really had these like 3 years of intense protests and resistance. And then I think we had the initial crackdown. And then what we've seen is this intentional, the tactics of the occupation have changed as well. And it's gone so, I think somebody said it, Tibet Network had it in their recent report, this cradle to grave project. So it's not enough to just stamp out resistance as it arises. I think what we've really come to realize that the design of what the Chinese government has done in Tibet, especially in the last 5, 6, 7 years, is to change the very identity of Tibetans, to eliminate the Tibetanness in Tibetans. And so we've seen this very calculated project, starting with the nomad resettlement we know has been happening now even before 2008, but we saw this, we've got to settle the nomads, we've got to clear out the monasteries, and we've got to indoctrinate the children. And I know, Ladin, you've been talking quite a bit about this in some of your recent talks, but it's quite crazy. Tibet Action Institute, we've been looking a little bit more even into some of what Tibetans had really done, I think, since the 2000s to protect the right of Tibetan children to be educated in Tibetan. And in spite of everything, the ability that Tibetans did that, they protected that. There was quite strong language laws, even in some of the Tibetan counties and prefectures, to make sure this whole generation of children was being taught Tibetan and growing up learning Tibetan. And now they've just gone in and smashed all of that. They've pushed this so-called bilingual education, which we all know what it really is, which is this Chinese curriculum with one Tibetan language class. And so I think the nature of the occupation has shifted in a way that it's harder sometimes for it to break through the media cycle. But at Tenor, as I think you've been writing more recently, you don't stamp out a people in one act or even in a couple of months. It's this insidious nature of what we've seen happening that just rolls out, and the next thing you know, you've lost language, you've lost the land. And so I think too, the Chinese government learned, okay, we got to do this in a really calculated, under the radar kind of way. So we're going to shut Tibet out to the world, and then what we're going to do is slowly erode the very identity of the people. And that doesn't always make the media, the 24-hour media cycle, but it is really, I think, the situation we're facing right now, and something that as a movement, and that we have to really talk about what's happening. We have to talk about this project and what it's doing, and we can't shy away from the fact that the intention here is to eliminate, I think, the very Tibetan identity. And that is something that's where I think from Tibet Action, looking at strategic nonviolent action and strategic nonviolent resistance and how you counter that kind of an elimination campaign is something we hopefully will get into as well in this podcast and in the future episodes, because I think this is a very timely conversation. So as we need to increase the access to Tibet and the information flow, we also, I think, need to learn even more ourselves and really understand what's happening.
Nathan, do you want to jump in with sort of on the info blackout that the Chinese have so successfully imposed over Tibet from a perspective of, you've been with Tibet Action since the beginning, you have seen the rollout of new technologies and communication technologies in Tibet, in the world, but just especially how they've affected connection to Tibet and communication ability for Tibetans from inside to reach outside and people outside to reach in. And now, where are we? What have you observed in the decade and a half that we've been doing this?
Maybe I want to take it from a different perspective and maybe get a conversation going a little bit, which is, what is the mindset of like a Tibetan person our age right now in Tibet who is more connected than ever? I think, as Tender said, right, we have this sort of dissonance of like, they've got 4G, they've got a smartphone, they have a social media feeds, this feeling of being connected but not connected. Maybe I'm asking the listener to be put in that mindset, of like they feel connected, yet we know at the same time surveillance is greater than ever. The feed of knowledge they're getting, it seems like a reality, but it's a curated reality. So it's hard to even tell when censorship is happening, right? And then there's this idea of a social credit system, which is all the signals that are emanating from your phone and your devices is influencing your opportunities, your family's opportunities, your children's opportunities. So what is someone thinking, when they're trying to decide, where their loyalty lies, where their action lies, where their future lies? I can talk about the Great Firewall. I can talk about censorship. The Chinese are state of the art. No one's better. They're exporting it around the world, Latin America, Africa. It's as dire as it can be from that perspective.
it opens up a really interesting reality about the Chinese government's system of controlling information, system of controlling the conversation, what is allowed, what is not allowed, right? And I think, like you said, Nathan, what the Chinese government has achieved is a level of sophistication could only be dreamed of in the past, even by a regime as totalitarian as, say, the Soviet Union, right?
Yeah.
It's like the technologies that exist right now, these were the kind of technologies that Stalin would like dream of, but we would never have a chance at utilizing these technologies, but they exist right now. And that's why I was listening to this conversation about the kind of strategies that the Chinese government uses on the internet, for example. The scholar who has written about this is Molly Roberts, who's written a book talking about 3 main strategies that the Chinese government uses. She calls them fear, friction, and flooding. And this is like, on the Chinese populace itself, there's the fear factor that keeps people from accessing information because they know that they will be punished severely for doing certain things, going to certain websites, right? Posting
having certain
exactly.
apps on their phone.
So just the fear factor is so great. And then on top of that, in the past, in the Soviet Union, it would have just been fear, right? But right now, the Chinese government also uses friction, which is when you are trying to access content that is political or sensitive or critical of the Chinese government, the internet slows down immediately. So they have reached that level of sophistication where if you are accessing normal information, your internet is really fast. But the minute you're trying to access something that was published on BBC, something that was published on a Tibetan news outlet, or something that's about His Holiness the Dalai Lama, internet immediately slows down, right? Then the third factor is flooding. They talk about flooding, where somebody posted something. Not only does that get taken down for political reasons, but actually that particular website or page or comment section or whatever just gets flooded by trolls, the government paid trolls, right? That for somebody who's, looking for a particular kind of information, just the flooding is so great that it keeps you from accessing what you're trying to find. So the combination of these 3 strategies just makes it so difficult for people to find the truth. And I think in a place like Tibet, this combination is much more severe because the fear portion of these 3 strategies is so great that alone just makes it impossible for people to have communication.
The real world impact of that fear we see when there are headlines like talking. So this is a story from January 14th of this year. News of Tibetan self-immolation protest surfaces after a 5-year delay. About the self-immolation protest of a 26-year-old Tibetan named Shermo in Shakchuka in Nakchu in Tibet, and we somehow didn't know about it for 5 years. And this is, this was a question that this was a protest or what happened. This 26-year-old young man died that same day, and relatives and people were detained for questioning. And so, it wasn't that this happened, and there are a couple cases of self-immolations where people aren't sure exactly if that's what it was or if it was a fire. This is the 157th that we know of for sure, but we found out 5 years later. I mean, that just really strikes me as such a good example of how, though we have this incredible connectivity and really every day, I wonder how many conversations are going on every day with how many people, thousands and thousands of Tibetans involved in these different groups and, WeChat groups, and they're not called rooms. Sorry, what are they called again? WeChat groups. Yeah, sorry, there are too many different social media special words for all these things.
Circles, squares.
But yeah, that news could go unreported outside of Tibet for so long is really kind of shocking.
Well, and you take the sort of the Tibet and Xinjiang examples of immolation and people giving their lives, and then extend that to Hong Kong, where those even trying to follow a apparent rule of law, a democratic process, all of this, right, are now facing such severe punishment. So I think we see how that calculation someone makes in their head, should I install this app that will help me be free? I don't know. Should I say this thing? Should I give my life if no one's going to know?
So there's the information blackout in the sense that, like Tender said, the fear factor. So people know the consequences will likely be dire if they share the news and information about what's happening on the ground at all. And then there's do people even engage in activities, or do they even download or, get onto certain platforms? What do we know about this is just maybe a question for you, Nathan, reports from on the ground. I mean, we hear from East Turkestan with the Uyghurs a lot about the security apps that people have to download to monitor all of their movements and to sort of to surveil them constantly. What do we know about those in Tibet? We hear less about that.
I mean, I think the idea of having a specific app is almost a short gap solution to basically just pulling in all the signals from the devices themselves. I mean, if you have an Android phone with Google's running your operating system, or Apple's running your operating system, they know kind of all the things they need to know about you without a special app. In Xinjiang and for the Uyghurs, having this police state app required was an interim step because there's so many different phone manufacturers, they can't really control them all. But that's, they can get a lot of those same signals from just the operating systems and the phones and the mobile networks themselves. But also, Xinjiang is a pilot for everywhere, right? And so the social credit apps are essentially a softer version of the same thing. If you want to do, banking and tied in and get train tickets and get these things, a variety of apps under different names allow you to tap into that system. And we also saw through COVID the piloting of these kind of control systems. Maybe for good cause and purpose, but it was the same body of tech. In the West, we have a lot of these things too, related to, that end up being around things like hailing cars or paying people, or, and it's a fine line where this tech, and it gets just pushed over to the authoritarian route. So I'm sure that, and I know that this tech has made it out of one specific region of China. It's just presented in different clothes, in different subtle ways. But ultimately, the phones just give off so much extra radiation of signals and information. And there was a startup video of a Chinese startup saying, we can tap into 30 different signals in someone's phone in order to decide if they're worthy of a loan, right? And it was like, how often they charge their battery. Do they keep their phone battery? How much spare space do they have on their phone? Do they upgrade? There's all these crazy other signals that were painting a picture of the character of a person, right? So that include how often do they go to the monastery? How many koras do they walk around? Is it 1 or 10? All these things. I mean, every moment of someone's life is instrumented, and that data is available to an authoritarian state. And we see it, Amazon does this. Again, this happens in the West, but it happens through a different rule of law and a different.
Yeah. I mean, I know there was one case recently in Surshu, in Kham, where it was crazy because I think what had sparked the initial protest was the Chinese authorities came into this one area and said, okay, it's not enough that it's not just that you can't have His Holiness on your altar, you actually have to have Xi Jinping's photo and other Chinese leaders. So they were going and they were actually going to bring a propaganda crew and film. I don't know if this was part of the 70th commemoration or what exactly the connection point was, but they were going to go into people's homes and film this. And I think that was the breaking point for people there. And so there was a protest by some young monks that was followed by a protest from, I think, 2 young teenage lay people handing out leaflets in front of the police station, and the protest by the monks. Laden, I think a bit more about this case, but I know one of the young monks ended up dying due to the injuries. And actually it was another monk who was, we saw that situation of the second monk who had actually sent the footage out, got the longer prison sentence even than the monks who were involved in the protests. But it wasn't enough that they clamped down then on the monks and arrested them, and then clamped down on the teenagers who had protested. But then they sent they called it like the Snow Wolf Patrol, or they sent this whole commando unit recently. This was quite recently in, and that was, Nate, one of the few proof that we'd heard that yes, they were specifically they were going home to home and requiring people to download that app now, so that they were saying they were doing it for the benefit of elders in the area. But it was when you look, and that story, I think one of the issues too is because you get snippets of this information, we had to piece this story together based on going back and sort of looking at, oh, okay, well, this thin piece of information came out on this, RFA report, and then there is another report that came out several months later, and you're piecing together the timeline of everything. But it does seem like they're trying to crack down on everything, and then now they're trying to control, Tender, as you said, even what people feel they can do on their phones by, just, I think whether they're actually what they're collecting on the phones, just that intimidation factor of them going home to home with this commando unit and downloading this. I just want to bring it to, I know we all know this, but for the audience, just how brave, and just that for me, what's remarkable is through all this, we continue, even if we're not necessarily maybe hearing as much of it as obviously it would be so helpful to hear, because we know both of the repression, but also the resistance that continues to happen inside. It's quite incredible in this Xi Jinping era. And maybe, when we talk about the Olympics and what allowing China to have the Olympics back in 2008, really, I do feel enabled Xi Jinping to now embolden Xi Jinping. Even in spite of what they've unleashed on people, just that the fact that people are still resisting is quite remarkable.
Two very short things just to paint the reality. One is, under COVID, if people's phones ran out of battery or they turned their phones off, they would get that visit on their door. Why is your phone off? So we can't even tell people, turn off your phones. No, they have to have it on. And then they can't leave a phone at home because everything now is with Alipay. Even the street vendor. You want to get some food on the street? How do you pay them? WeChat, Alipay, QR code. So you can't turn your phone off. You can't not have a phone. And the phone is the permanent tracker. So,
I remember hearing about something about North Korea, where everybody has a radio at home and you can never turn off the radio. You can change the volume, you can turn it up, down, but you can never turn it off. But even those people in North Korea, if they leave the house, the radio is stuck at home. So they're momentarily away from the radio. They're not being tracked by any equipment. But right now we are talking about, in Tibet, if people cannot turn off their phones and they have to keep it charged at all times, then they are tracked at all times. It's really kind of reminiscent of what one of our friends, Lo Sang, he was telling me about when he was growing up. He remembers that time in Amdo when actually there was a similar kind of rule about radios. He said, there used to be radios that you could never turn off. He said you could play with the volume, but nobody could ever turn off that radio. And people feel like we have come so far from that particular era, but actually we are still in that era. Only the equipments have changed. The rules haven't changed.
Just jumping to another piece of this sort of information blackout. So Kate talked about the difficulty of piecing together a story over days, weeks, months, in some cases years. And then that is a very hard thing to get any mainstream media interested in any kind of real breaking news or long form way, because more often than not, the media, they want to go themselves, they want to see themselves, they want to talk to, get eyewitness accounts from people. And that is just, of course, where we come up against this wall with Tibet. How do you, when the climate of fear is and the consequences are so great, and when the access is totally restricted, then we ourselves are just trying to piece together the story of what's really happening on the ground. How do we get these, the word of what's happening in Tibet out to the world, to decision makers, to governments, to the people that can help drive policy, make things, happen or change, put consequences, sanctions on the Chinese government? And I just wanted to point out, actually, right now, we found out that there is Chinese government is organizing a rare, coordinated, organized media junket sort of tour of not Tibet, but of Lhasa and Ningti, or Ningti as the Chinese say, right now. And, we were trying to look at, we know the Associated Press is on that tour. And we were trying to look at when the last time they were there. And it seems like maybe at least AP Photo hasn't even been there hasn't not been able to access the Tibetan Autonomous Region, or what China calls Tibet, but central Western Tibet, since 2010, maybe even before. So if you can imagine, right, one of the biggest news agencies in the world has not had any meaningful access to Tibet for over, at least photo, for over a decade. That is, it's just, as Tibetan rights activist campaigners, it is just such a massive challenge for us to do our work, to, get the word out, to help Tibetans from inside amplify their voices and get the word out. I don't know, does anybody have any thoughts about, Tendor, you're talking about North Korea. And I was thinking about that idea that I think it was maybe Sophie Richardson from Human Rights Watch who said covering Tibet for them is like information gathering is sort of like how they have to cover North Korea, which is like with no access and very little information coming out from on the ground. They can't really plan at the beginning of the year what exactly they're going to work on and get out of Tibet in a really, direct way, because it's just the access is so limited and the information coming out is so spotty.
In terms of foreign correspondents and journalists, I just think back to a decade ago or 2008. There's just so many fewer correspondents over there. There's been a bunch who've been driven out, first of all. And I was trying to, maybe somebody else remembers on, it was actually a correspondent, maybe for the Wall Street Journal or Washington Post, who her final post, she had talked about coming from North Korea, actually, or coming from, she'd written a book on North Korea and really coming to Beijing and thinking, oh, this is going to be so different, and trying in her mind not to make the comparisons to her knowledge of North Korea. And she just found she couldn't stop making the comparisons, because reporting from China now feels like reporting from North Korea. And the number of journalists who've been harassed, chased out, not had their visas extended or had their visas cut off. This is something that should be deeply concerning for the world. Yes, for Tibet too, of course, but it's just been a targeted attack, it seems. And at the same time, as we were preparing, just looking at what this media junket, because we know those are heavily surveilled and scrutinized, and the journalists have such little freedom when they're actually in Tibet. But I think what we've seen in the last number of years too is the rise in Chinese English language media. And so now you're the CDGN, you're getting all these journalists, actually Western non-Chinese journalists, who are actually having access to Tibet, or these Instagram characters who are able to go and even though you can't, have access to Instagram in China, they're allowed to report on Tibet. And so I think what the Chinese government has realized is we're going to clamp down on the space that, the rest of the world's media has to Tibet, China, East Turkestan, everywhere, and at the same time increase our own propaganda media targeting a non-Chinese, a Western audience, and try and feed more of a media stream to them. So I think that's deeply concerning. And maybe Tender, you remember. Yeah, that's new for sure. We weren't facing that back in 2008.
Yeah, I think the trend that you just mentioned, Kate, one interesting detail about that trend that we have seen is how this kind of blackout started from Tibet. How 2009, 10, 11, 12, we remember how it became harder and harder for international media to even go on those fake junket, right? The government organized kind of tours to Tibet. It became harder for international tourists to travel to Tibet. It became harder for other types of foreign visitors even to get some access to not just Tibet Autonomous Region, but even outside the autonomous region, places like Kamen Amdo just became inaccessible, right? And even during that period, there were China observers who were still hoping that mainland China would somehow remain immune from those trends, or somehow Xi Jinping would still continue to open up, or at least not regress the situation in China. But I think that was what happened since then. And now what we are seeing in China, the way the correspondent was reporting, it felt just like North Korea. That story just reminds me of how what we've been trying to tell people. It might happen in Tibet today, but it doesn't stay there. What happens in Tibet doesn't stay there. As in, like, when it's a repression, it spreads to other places. So the same kind of repressive media situation is now we are witnessing in China as well. And that's why it's not, something that people can reject by saying, oh, it's just that one place called Tibet, everything else is fine. It's actually all connected. And if you don't try to deal with it or contain it, everybody gets affected eventually, as we are seeing now.
And I can't tell you how many Huawei buildings there are in countries in Africa now, providing their new infrastructure, and solving these same problems of we must modernize and harmonize to.
Yeah, and I think that's, for us and on so many levels as Tibetans, as Tibet activists, as people doing this work for multiple decades now, we can see, we've said as Tibet goes, so goes the world. And, this is for us such a painful reality that we've been trying to speak about for a long time, whether that is the question of just the territorial, the land grab, the occupation of Tibet, and China being allowed to get away with that, and in fact emboldened and sanctioned and, encouraged on some level by the way the international community has treated China through all these years. And then you see, there was a time, Tender, we were discussing this, there was a time when Hong Kong, not that long ago, seemed like people felt it was quite safe and secure in its position. And what did we say? How did we feel? We felt like it's just a matter of time. This Beijing regime, the nature of the Chinese Communist Party and their rule and the way that they were moving, there was no way that Hong Kong was just going to be allowed to become more and more democratic and ultimately like a free city, a free state, really, in the People's Republic of China. And look at where we are now. The world didn't know what was happening in East Turkestan to the Uyghur people in what China calls Xinjiang. But it was, repression has been happening there for decades as well. But the world did know what was happening in Tibet. And, the international community has done, obviously, we believe, not enough and too little. And now look at, at least the spotlight has been shining in Tibet all these years through the hard work and the leadership of the Tibet movement, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the Tibetan government. We have made it very difficult to ignore what's happening in Tibet, and we have pushed maybe the Chinese government to mitigate their policies, its actions in Tibet to a certain degree. And look at what freehand and the war on terror and falsely classifying Uyghurs as Islamic terrorists, fundamentalists. Look what the Chinese government has done there, the level to which they've blatantly taken the repression and the madness. And we're talking about genocide and crimes against humanity in 2021 by the next Olympic host. So, Tibet's kind of been the canary in the coal mine for a while. And that's one of the things that we've definitely tried to explain to people and decision makers and global public why Tibet matters. Why Tibet is a critical piece of the story of China and China's place and role in the world, and what kind of actor, good or bad, China will be, and the Chinese government is. Any closing thoughts from people? Anything you want to say? Anything at all?
Other trends on the tech front that China is playing a leading role on are artificial intelligence, machine learning, which is obviously huge, and cryptocurrencies, which is obviously huge. So the role in these kind of destabilizing, power shifting, truly fundamentally power shifting technologies that China is playing is really outsized so far in many ways, be it, establishing a presence in Silicon Valley and recruiting some of the top talent on the machine learning front, or allowing for some time for the kind of control of the mining of Bitcoin to move to more unregulated parts of China, and really seizing an outsized share of power in that economy. So awareness of these things and looking even a few years ahead to the Olympics and how they'll continue to impact things, I think is important, and keeping tabs on that. And there is more awareness of this. I mean, there's more interest globally from academics and from the tech sector, which is to our benefit, of the authentic concerns about this, the not kind of power mongering, warmongering hype, but the authentic issues with Huawei's infrastructure, or the role of an authoritarian technology sort of environment coming into international standards bodies. So there's lots of ways to consider this and confront this, and to take advantage of the fact that Chinese companies still kind of want to be cool and on the mainstream, and think about the TikToks and navigate these. So there's opportunity there, but there's also a pretty even darker dystopia in our future if we don't pay attention. So,
and I agree with that thought that the future has not been decided yet. I know there are people out there who are quite alarmist about the situation, and who not just alarmist, who are quite pessimistic and very cynical about the situation, who say that it's too late to hold China back. That window of opportunity is over, it's closed, and there's no stopping China from becoming the number one power in the world. And then on the other side, I know there are people who say, no, there's no need to worry about it. There's no way that a authoritarian or a totalitarian regime can actually become number one. There's no way that they can edge out the US. And so people who are quite, reassured about it, that something like that will never happen. I think neither is certain. Neither scenario is actually written, and neither is certain. I think we live in uncertainty, and what happens 10 years down the road, what kind of a world we live in 15, 20 years time, will the world's most powerful hegemon be a totalitarian, big data driven dictatorship, or will it be still led by a free and democratic nation, or will we continue to be in some kind of a liberal world order? I think that is not determined. And what we do in the coming years, and also what people who cherish freedom and who work for freedom, who want to promote democracy and advance the democratic freedoms and institutions, what these people and what these groups of people do, especially, what we are able to contribute. I think these are the things that will definitely be a contributing factor to deciding what happens in the future.
And I just wanted to give a shout out actually to the Tibet movement as having a big role to play. And London, I think there's a feeling sometimes, I think, in a movement, if we haven't gotten there yet, by now, after all of this work, then we failed. And actually, London, I think what you just said is the success of the movement has been that Tibet has been able to stay in the spotlight. There's been peaks and troughs, but there's definitely been peaks. And I think the hard work of so many people and so many Tibetans, and just continuing to do the work, when the Tibet movement really puts its sights on something, I mean, within 10 months, we got, Apple to talk to us. We've gotten Confucius Institute shut down. There is so much potential there, because the Chinese government is still so vulnerable in many respects. I mean, I think we have not even started really to apply multilateral pressure on them. I think the movement is all over the world, is so dynamic. We have so many young people involved, and there's so many creative new ways and I know we're going to talk about this further into the podcast. And I think there's a feeling right now, what hope is there? And I just think there is a lot of potential and opportunity. And I think that, it might require new strategies and new messaging. And that's, I think, what we're really excited to work with people. But we can't forget that Tibet should have been done by now. It should have been over, and it's because of the Tibetan people, His Holiness, the Tibetan government exile, and the Tibet movement front and center, keeping this going and this resistance there and in the media, and we can do it. We can figure it out. So, yes, Xi Jinping has got a lot of power amassed around him, but the more power you amass, the harder you fall. So I think that's important to note.
Great. Well, thank you for being a part of this first podcast and for a great conversation. I think we'll figure this out as we go along, but just to have a constant conversation about Tibet for the Tibet movement, for Tibetans, for supporters, and for people to better understand our issue, the Sino-Tibetan conflict, and to understand not just the issue itself, but to understand the strategies and the tactics and the ways that we can fight to amplify Tibetan voices from inside Tibet, to push for the human rights and freedom and the opportunities for every Tibetan inside Tibet to be allowed to live in the world as they see fit. Thank you to all you guys for your time, and look forward to talking to you again soon.